Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. The Meeting. The early morning haze clung to the cobblestone streets of Montreal, the city slowly waking under the gentle amber light filtering through the wrought iron lampposts. Eleanor adjusted her scarf, the autumn chill biting her cheeks, and quickened her pace toward the cafe. She was late, again. Her editor's scathing email still echoed in her head, urging her to get the interviews done yesterday. She could already picture his furrowed brow and tight-lipped sighs. "Excuse me," she muttered, narrowly avoiding colliding with a tall figure standing just outside the cafe door. The man turned toward her. His presence was magnetic, and for a moment Eleanor forgot the biting wind. He had tousled dark hair, his olive-toned skin faintly glowing under the soft sunlight. But it was his eyes, dark and unfathomable, as if carrying secrets she wasn't meant to uncover. That stopped her. "You're in a hurry," he said, his accent tinged with something she couldn't place. Eastern European, maybe? Yes, she stammered, stepping aside to let him pass. He didn't move, studying her with an intensity that made her pull her coat tighter. Finally, he smiled, a soft, lopsided grin, and pushed the cafe door open for her. "After you." Inside, the air was warm, filled with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked pastries. Eleanor nodded her thanks, hurrying to the counter, but she felt his gaze lingering as she ordered her usual latte. She risked a glance back. He'd taken a seat by the window, a leather-bound notebook in front of him. His pen moved swiftly, the pages filling with what she assumed were thoughts or sketches. For a moment, their eyes met again. He didn't look away. Curiosity gnawed at her. The interview could wait. Taking her coffee, she walked over. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. He looked up, his expression unreadable, then gestured to the seat across from him. "Eleanor," she introduced herself, holding out her hand. "Dimitri," he replied, shaking it. His grip was firm, his hand warm despite the chill. "You're not from here, are you?" she ventured, sipping her coffee. Dimitri chuckled, a deep, resonant sound. "What gave it away?" "Just a guess," she said, smiling. "What brings you to Montreal?" He hesitated, his fingers tracing the edges of the notebook. "Work," he said simply. "What kind of work?" He leaned back, the sunlight catching his features. "Let's just say, I observe people. Their stories fascinate me." Eleanor's journalistic instincts flared. "A writer?" "Of sorts," he said cryptically. For the next hour they talked about the city, its history, and their shared love for art and literature. Eleanor found herself captivated by his perspectives, his quiet charisma pulling her in, but Dimitri remained elusive, his answers vague when she pressed about his past. As the conversation waned, he closed his notebook and stood. "It was nice meeting you, Eleanor. Perhaps we'll meet again." "Wait," she blurted. "Will you be here tomorrow?" Dimitri's smile returned, softer this time. "Perhaps." Eleanor returned to the cafe the next morning, and the morning after that, her anticipation growing with each visit. And each time, Dimitri was there, always by the window, his notebook in hand. They fell into a rhythm, their conversations spanning topics from philosophy to poetry, each revealing pieces of themselves. But Dimitri's mystery only deepened. He never gave away too much, skillfully deflecting questions about his life outside the cafe. It frustrated Eleanor, but it also intrigued her. She began to imagine a life beyond these fleeting mornings, a life where Dimitri was more than a stranger. One day, emboldened by the connection she felt, she reached across the table, her hand covering his. "I don't know who you are, Dimitri," she said softly, "but I want to." His expression darkened, the warmth in his eyes replaced by something colder. He pulled his hand away. "Eleanor," he began, his voice heavy, "you're a kind soul. Too kind. That's why I need to end this before it goes any further." "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her heart pounding. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Goodbye, Eleanor." That night, as Eleanor lay in bed replaying their last conversation, her phone buzzed. It was an email, a forwarded article from an anonymous sender. The headline sent a chill down her spine. "Wanted international fugitive found dead in Paris. Alleged spy Dmitry Ivanov identified." The photo beneath the headline was unmistakable. Dimitri's enigmatic smile stared back at her. Her breath caught. She scrambled to check the date, 3 days ago. And yet she'd seen him just that morning. Chapter 2. Whispers in the shadows. Eleanor sat frozen in her dimly lit bedroom, the glow of her laptop casting ghostly shadows across the walls. Her eyes remained fixed on the article, heart pounding with each reread. Dmitry Ivanov. Dead. 3 days ago. She closed the laptop, the edges of reality and illusion blurring. This has to be a mistake, she thought, gripping the fabric of her blanket. Yet the image from the article, his unmistakable features, the same penetrating gaze, left no room for denial. And this morning he had been real. Warm. Alive. Her phone vibrated, the sound piercing the eerie silence. She hesitated before answering. Hello? Her voice trembled. Eleanor, a voice murmured, low and distorted. It was unmistakably Dmitry's. Dmitry, she gasped, gripping the phone tighter. Listen carefully, you need to leave your apartment, now. What? Why? Her voice rose, panic creeping in. There isn't time to explain, he said, urgency cutting through the distortion. They'll come for you if they know you've seen me. Who are they? What's going on? Dmitry paused, the line crackling. Trust me, go to the park by the waterfront, the bench near the willow tree. I'll find you. Before she could argue, the line went dead. Eleanor's hands shook as she slipped on her coat. Logic screamed at her to stay put, to call someone, anyone, for help. But something deeper, something unspoken, urged her to follow Dmitry's instructions. The streets were nearly deserted as she hurried toward the waterfront. Her breath fogged the air, the chilly night wrapping around her like a cloak. She spotted the willow tree easily, its branches swaying in the wind, whispering secrets to the dark. The bench beneath it was empty. She sat, clutching her coat, her senses hyper-aware. Every sound, a distant car, the rustle of leaves, her own heartbeat, felt amplified. You came. The voice made her jump. Dmitry stepped out from the shadows, his dark figure blending seamlessly with the night. You owe me an explanation, she demanded, standing to face him. He nodded, his expression solemn. You're right. I owe you the truth. They sat on the bench, his words unraveling the threads of the mystery. I was born Dmitry Ivanov in Odessa, he began, his voice heavy with memories. But the name you know, Dmitry, is just one of many. What does that mean? Eleanor asked, struggling to keep up. I've lived a life few could understand, he said. A life of deception, betrayal, and survival. For years, I was a ghost, an asset for governments, corporations, anyone willing to pay the price. My skills? Observation, extraction, elimination. She flinched at the final word. You were a spy? He hesitated before nodding. But I walked away from that life, or at least I tried to. The people I worked for, they don't let anyone leave. Eleanor's mind raced. The vague answers, his cryptic demeanor. It all made sense now. But why are you here? Why did you come to me? Dmitry's gaze softened, a rare vulnerability flickering across his face. Because you were my last connection to something real, something pure. Eleanor swallowed hard, emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. Then what about the article? The photos? How can you be dead? It's what I needed them to believe, he said. I staged my own death, burned every bridge, destroyed every trail that could lead to me. But coming to Montreal to you, it was reckless, and now they know. Who are they? She pressed. The organization I worked for, he said grimly. If they think you're involved, they won't hesitate to eliminate you to get to me. The weight of his words hit her like a tidal wave. So what do we do? Dmitry stood, his figure imposing against the faint glow of the street lamps. We run. Eleanor had no time to argue. Within minutes, they were in a car Dmitry had parked nearby, speeding toward the city's outskirts. I don't understand why I'm involved in this, Eleanor said, her voice shaky. I was just someone you talked to at a cafe. You were more than that, Dmitry said quietly. You reminded me of what I'd lost, of what life could be without shadows. Eleanor didn't know how to respond. The sincerity in his voice disarmed her, yet the danger they faced was all too real. As the car sped through the darkened roads, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. Dmitry's expression hardened. They found us. The car behind them accelerated, its beams flooding their interior. A shot rang out, the back windshield shattering. Eleanor screamed as Dmitry swerved, narrowly avoiding an oncoming truck. Hold on, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. They veered onto a dirt road, the forest swallowing them whole. The pursuing car followed, its tires kicking up clouds of dust and debris. When they finally lost their pursuers, Dmitry pulled the car into a hidden alcove and killed the engine. Silence enveloped them, broken only by their ragged breathing. "What now?" Eleanor whispered. Dmitri reached for something beneath his seat, a small, leather-bound notebook, the same one he always carried. He handed it to her. "What is this?" she asked, her fingers trembling. "Everything," he said. "Every truth about me, my past, the people chasing us. If anything happens to me, you take it to someone you trust, someone who can protect you." Eleanor opened the notebook, her eyes scanning the pages. Names, places, diagrams, all written in a precise, hurried hand. It was overwhelming. "Dmitri, I don't." A single gunshot shattered the night. Dmitri fell forward, a crimson stain blooming across his chest. "Dmitri!" Eleanor cried, catching him as his weight collapsed against her. His lips moved, but no sound came. The life in his eyes flickered, then faded. The next morning, the police found her by the side of the road, clutching the notebook and Dmitri's lifeless body. When they questioned her, she told them everything, except for the notebook. That she kept hidden. Weeks later, as she sat in her apartment, she opened it again. On the very last page, written in hurried, scrawling letters, was a single line. "Trust no one, not even yourself." Her blood ran cold as she stared at the note, the reflection in her window shifting ever so slightly. A shadow she hadn't moved. Chapter 3. Shadows Within Shadows. Eleanor's breath caught as she stared at the reflection in the window. The figure behind her was barely visible, blending seamlessly into the dim light of her apartment. Her mind raced. Was it exhaustion, paranoia, or something far more sinister? Slowly, she turned, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was empty. She let out a shaky exhale, her grip tightening on the leather-bound notebook. The weight of Dmitri's final words, "Trust no one, not even yourself," pressed on her like a lead blanket. Am I losing my mind? The days that followed were a blur of unease. Eleanor avoided the cafe, the park, and any place where she'd once felt comfort. Her phone buzzed incessantly with calls from friends, colleagues, even the police. But she ignored them all. The notebook consumed her. Its pages were filled with cryptic entries, each more alarming than the last. June 18th, Vienna, intercepted message. Target compromised. September 3rd, Prague. The mole is inside the circle. November 21st, Montreal. The sleeper agent activated. Code E451. And then on the final pages, her own name appeared. Eleanor Walsh. Unknowing variable. Potential activation. She slammed the notebook shut, her hands trembling. Activation? What did that even mean? Dmitri had insisted she was innocent, a bystander caught in his dangerous web. But the notebook seemed to suggest otherwise. Eleanor began to doubt everything. Dmitri's story, his motives, even her own memories. One evening, as the winter wind howled outside, she decided she couldn't face it alone any longer. She flipped through her contacts and dialed the one person she thought she could trust, Alex Carter, an investigative journalist and a friend from her university days. "Eleanor?" Alex's voice was groggy but concerned. "It's late. Are you okay?" "I need your help," she whispered. "Can we meet?" "Somewhere safe." "Of course. What's going on?" "I'll explain everything when I see you," she said, her voice trembling. "Just please come." They met at an old diner on the outskirts of the city, far from prying eyes. Alex arrived first, his sharp features creased with worry. He stood as she entered, pulling her into a tight hug. "You look terrible," he said. "Thanks," she muttered, sliding into the booth. She handed him the notebook. "Read this." Alex frowned, but did as she asked, his eyes widening with every page. By the time he finished, his hands were gripping the edges of the notebook so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low, "do you have any idea what this is?" "I thought it was just Dmitri's record of his past," she said, her voice shaking. "But now, I don't know. It mentions me, Alex. Why would it mention me?" Alex leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just a record. It's a blueprint. A roadmap of covert operations, blackmail, and high-level corruption. If this falls into the wrong hands, people will die. And you," he hesitated, "you might be one of their assets." "That's impossible," Eleanor hissed. "I'm not some spy. I'm a journalist, for God's sake." Alex sighed, rubbing his temples. "You might not even know. If what this says is true, there are methods, conditioning, manipulation, memory suppression. They could have used you without your knowledge." Eleanor shook her head violently. "No. I would remember. I would know. if someone had done that to me. Would you? Alex asked quietly. As they left the diner, Eleanor felt the weight of Alex's words pressing down on her. Could it be true? Had her life been orchestrated without her knowledge? Stay at my place tonight, Alex offered. It's safer than going back to your apartment. She nodded, too exhausted to argue. But as they approached his car, Eleanor noticed something strange. A black sedan idling across the street, its windows tinted. She froze. Alex, she whispered, tugging his sleeve. He followed her gaze and swore under his breath. Get in the car, now. The drive to Alex's apartment was tense, the black sedan following them at a distance. Do you think it's them? Eleanor asked, clutching the notebook. Who else? Alex muttered, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. When they reached his apartment, Alex quickly ushered her inside, locking the door behind them. We'll figure this out, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Eleanor sat on the couch, flipping through the notebook again. A small envelope fell from between the pages, landing at her feet. She picked it up, her name scrawled on the front in Dimitri's handwriting. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside was a single photograph. Her. But not just her. She was standing next to Dimitri in what looked like a lavish ballroom, her arm linked with his. She was smiling, wearing a dress she didn't recognize, surrounded by people whose faces were unfamiliar. What is it? Alex asked, leaning over her shoulder. She handed him the photo, her voice barely a whisper. I don't remember this. Alex's face paled. This is a gala in Vienna. Last year. I covered it for a story. Eleanor, you were there? I wasn't, she insisted, panic rising. I've never been to Vienna. Alex's expression darkened. Then we have a bigger problem than I thought. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw flashes of the photograph. The ballroom, the strangers, Dimitri's knowing smile. Was it a planted memory? A fabrication? Or worse, was it real? At some point, exhaustion overtook her. When she awoke, Alex was gone. The apartment was eerily silent. She called out his name, but there was no response. On the kitchen counter, she found a note. Eleanor, I went to meet a source. Stay here and don't leave. I'll be back soon, Alex. But something felt off. She noticed his laptop was still on the dining table, its screen glowing softly. Curious, she approached it. On the screen was a draft of an article, The Unknowing Spy, a case study in covert conditioning. Her name was in the first line. Her blood turned to ice. Behind her, the floor creaked. She spun around, but it was too late. A sharp pain exploded at the base of her skull, and the world went dark. Eleanor woke in a sterile, windowless room. Her head throbbed, and her wrists were bound to the arms of a cold metal chair. Across from her sat a woman in a crisp black suit, her expression calm but piercing. Eleanor Walsh, the woman said, her voice smooth. Or should I call you E451? Eleanor's stomach churned. What do you want? The woman smiled. Oh, my dear, you've already given us exactly what we wanted. She slid the leather-bound notebook across the table. Eleanor's breath hitched. No, Alex wouldn't. Alex. The woman laughed. He's been one of ours all along. The room seemed to spin as Eleanor's world unraveled. You see, the woman continued, you were always meant to return this to us. The question is, will you do so willingly, or must we activate you? Eleanor's screams echoed in the sterile room as the lights flickered, and the whispers of her fractured past began to surface. Chapter 4. Activation. The sterile room felt like a void, suffocating Eleanor in its emptiness. Her head throbbed with the echoes of the woman's words. E451. Activation. I don't know what you're talking about, she cried, struggling against the restraints. The woman leaned forward, her expression a mask of calm authority. Eleanor, denial won't help you. You've spent your entire life playing a role, a part carefully designed by us. It's time you embraced who you really are. Eleanor's heart raced. You're lying. I'm nobody, just a journalist. The woman raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a faint smile. If that were true, why do you remember the ballroom? Eleanor froze. I don't. Ah, but you do, the woman interrupted, her voice sharp. The flash of the chandeliers, the faces of the guests, the way Dimitri held your arm. These memories aren't fabricated, Eleanor. They're real. Locked away, yes, but real. Eleanor shook her head violently. No, that's not possible. The woman straightened, tapping a small device on the table. A monitor on the wall flickered to life, displaying grainy footage of the ballroom. Eleanor gasped. There she was, dressed in the same elegant gown as in the photo, her arm entwined with Dimitri's. She moved through the crowd with poise, her expression unreadable yet commanding. What is this? Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. This, the woman said, is you, the real you, the one trained to blend into any environment, to observe and report, to eliminate threats when necessary. No, Eleanor screamed, tears streaming down her face. You're wrong. I don't remember any of this. The woman sighed, her patience unyielding. Of course you don't. That's the brilliance of our programming. E451, or as you've come to know her, Eleanor Walsh, was designed to forget after every mission. A clean slate, perfectly integrated into civilian life. Eleanor's mind spiraled into chaos. Could it be true? Was she living a lie? The woman rose, circling Eleanor like a predator. We need your skills once more, she said. The notebook you've so carefully protected, it holds the keys to dismantling what's left of us. Dimitri thought he could betray the system, but he underestimated our reach. He underestimated you. Eleanor's breathing quickened. I didn't betray anyone. I'm not part of this. The woman leaned in close, her cold gaze piercing. You already were. The moment Dimitri approached you at that cafe, he awakened something dormant. He knew who you were. He thought he could turn you against us. But you're ours, Eleanor. You always have been. Why me? Eleanor demanded, her voice cracking. Because you're the best, the woman said simply. And now it's time to remember. The woman tapped the device again, and a sharp tone filled the room. Eleanor winced, a sudden pressure building in her head. Memories, fragmented and disjointed, flooded her mind. A cold training facility, the hum of machinery, a voice repeating her designation, E451. She saw herself assembling a weapon, dismantling it with precision, a mission in a crowded square. The target neutralized before anyone noticed. Dimitri, his face inches from hers, whispering, "One day you'll see the truth." Eleanor gasped, the pain unbearable. "Stop!" She begged, tears streaming down her face. The woman smiled coldly. "It's all coming back, isn't it?" When the pressure subsided, Eleanor slumped in the chair, her chest heaving. The memories felt both alien and familiar, as if they belonged to someone else yet lived within her. "What do you want from me?" she asked weakly. "The notebook," the woman said, her tone firm, "and your cooperation. Help us recover what Dimitri stole, and you'll be free to live your life." "And if I refuse?" The woman's smile vanished. "Refusal isn't an option. We'll activate you fully. You won't remember this conversation, this resistance. You'll obey without question, just as you were trained to." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. A spark of defiance flared within her. "This isn't who I am. I'm more than their pawn." Before the woman could react, Eleanor lurched forward, slamming her forehead into the woman's nose. She cried out, stumbling backward as blood poured down her face. Eleanor twisted in the chair, using her momentum to tip it over. She landed hard, the impact loosening one of the restraints. Adrenaline surged through her as she freed herself, grabbing the woman's device from the table. Alarms blared as Eleanor bolted from the room, her mind racing. She didn't know where she was or how to escape, but she knew one thing. She couldn't let them win. The corridors were a maze of sterile walls and blinding fluorescent lights. Eleanor ran, clutching the device, her bare feet slapping against the cold floor. "Subject E451 is loose," a voice shouted behind her. Guards appeared, their heavy boots echoing down the hallway. Eleanor ducked into a side room, her heart pounding. She needed a plan. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on a ventilation grate. Without hesitation, she pried it open and crawled inside, the metal biting into her palms and knees. Minutes felt like hours as she navigated the cramped ducts. Voices echoed below, their orders sharp and precise. "She can't have gone far. Seal off all exits. We need her alive." Eleanor gritted her teeth, pushing herself forward. "Alive for now," she thought grimly. Finally, she emerged into an empty storage room. She grabbed a lab coat from a nearby rack and draped it over herself, blending in as she stepped into the hallway. Her heart raced as she passed a group of guards. They barely glanced at her, their focus on the search. Eleanor eventually found herself in what looked like a control room. Monitors displayed live feeds of the facility, guards moving in tight formations. She spotted an exit at the edge of the compound. heavily guarded but accessible. She also spotted something else, a safe with the notebook locked inside. Her instincts screamed to leave, to escape while she could. But a part of her, the part Dmitri had awakened, refused to abandon the truth. If I leave without it, they'll come after me, after anyone I care about. Eleanor took a deep breath, her determination solidifying. She wasn't just running anymore. She was fighting back. Chapter 5. The Final Act. The cold air bit at Eleanor's skin as she sprinted into the forest, the notebook tucked tightly under her arm. Behind her, the facility erupted in chaos, alarms, shouting guards, and the roar of vehicles firing to life. Every step she took felt heavier, her body screaming in protest, but she couldn't stop. Not now. She could hear Alex's voice in her mind, calm and steady. When they come for you, run. Don't stop. Don't trust anyone. And most importantly, keep the notebook safe. But Alex was gone now. Dmitri was gone. And if she failed, she would be next. Eleanor reached a small clearing where a helicopter waited. Its rotors spun slowly, stirring up snow and dead leaves. She froze. A man stepped out of the shadows, his figure tall and imposing. It was Dmitri. Her heart skipped a beat. No, that's impossible. You're dead. The man smiled faintly, his face half hidden by the shadows. And yet, here I am. Eleanor's grip on the notebook tightened. What is this? Another one of their tricks? Not a trick, Dmitri said. His voice was softer than she remembered, almost kind. The truth is rarely simple, Eleanor. Her mind reeled as she pieced together the fragments of her reality. You're working with them, aren't you? Dmitri didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured to the helicopter. Get in. I'll explain everything. Eleanor didn't move. No. You explain here. Now. Dmitri sighed. You were always stubborn. He took a cautious step closer, his hands raised in surrender. You've been a part of this game longer than you realize. Everything you've done, everything you think you chose, it was orchestrated. By them. By me. Even by you. Eleanor's knees threatened to give out. What are you saying? I'm saying that this, he motioned to the chaos around them, the notebook in her hand, wasn't an accident. It was a contingency plan. You're not just E45E1. You're the failsafe, the final key. Eleanor's breath hitched. No, that's not true. I didn't sign up for this. You didn't have to, Dmitri said gently. You were created for it. She staggered back, her world crumbling. I don't believe you. You don't have to, Dmitri replied. But they're coming, and you have two choices. Stay and fight a war you can't win, or come with me and finish what we started. What did we start? She demanded, tears burning her eyes. The truth, Dmitri said simply. Eleanor's mind raced. Trusting Dmitri felt like stepping off a ledge, but staying here meant certain death, or worse, capture. Her hand trembled as she clutched the notebook, the weight of its secrets pressing down on her. Why should I believe you? She asked. Dmitri's expression softened. Because you already do. The roar of approaching vehicles broke the moment. Headlights pierced the darkness, their beams sweeping over the clearing. Eleanor made her decision. She bolted for the helicopter. Dmitri followed, shouting orders to the pilot. The rotors roared to life as they climbed aboard, the wind deafening. As the helicopter lifted off, Eleanor looked down to see Sarah emerge from the tree line, her face a mask of fury. Their eyes locked. For a fleeting second, Eleanor saw something she hadn't expected. Fear. The helicopter ascended, carrying Eleanor and Dmitri into the night. For the first time in days, Eleanor felt a sliver of hope. Now what? She asked, her voice barely audible over the noise. Dmitri leaned back, his gaze distant. Now we burn it all down. Eleanor clutched the notebook tighter, her resolve hardening. She didn't know who she could trust or even who she truly was. But she knew one thing. This wasn't over. Epilogue, a new beginning. Months later, Eleanor stood on a crowded street in a city she didn't recognize, her face hidden under a hood. She was no longer Eleanor Walsh, journalist. She was no longer E451, the agent. She was someone new. Her phone buzzed with a message from an encrypted number. The world is watching. Your move. Eleanor smiled faintly, slipping the phone back into her pocket. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time, she was the one writing the story. Chapter 1. The Unseen Path. It was late afternoon when Emily first noticed him. She was sitting at a small cafe by the window, the soft hum of the city outside just a background to the quiet tension of her own thoughts. The sunlight streamed through the glass, casting a golden glow on the table where her half-finished cup of coffee rested, now cold and unappealing. The weight of the day pressed down on her, each hour slipping away like sand through her fingers. She had no particular reason for feeling so weary. Perhaps it was just the endless cycle of trying to move forward without knowing where to go. The cafe was a familiar place, a sanctuary from the chaos of her life, where she could briefly escape into the quiet corner of the world she had built for herself. But today, something was different. He walked in as though the moment had been scripted, every movement precise, purposeful, as if he belonged there. Tall and well-dressed, his dark hair slightly tousled as though he had just woken up from a dream, he scanned the room with a quiet intensity. And then his eyes met hers. Emily's heart gave an unexpected jolt. She wasn't one to believe in love at first sight. After all, life wasn't a movie. But there was something about the way he looked at her, something that made her feel as though they had always known each other, like some invisible thread connected them across time and space. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world outside seemed to fade away, the murmur of the cafe's chatter falling into a soft, distant hum. It was as if the universe had narrowed down to this single, fleeting second. Then, just as quickly, the spell was broken. He looked away, giving her a faint smile before continuing towards the counter. Emily blinked, trying to shake off the odd sensation, but her chest still ached with something unfamiliar. It wasn't just attraction. It was as though she had caught a glimpse of something larger, something she wasn't ready to understand yet. She told herself it was nothing, just another face in the crowd, another fleeting moment. But she couldn't stop her thoughts from following him, from wondering who he was and why her heart had reacted the way it had. There was something magnetic about him, something elusive that drew her in without even trying. For the next few days, she found herself returning to that same cafe, hoping to catch another glimpse of him. She couldn't explain why, but it felt like fate was guiding her, nudging her towards something important. Each day she arrived, she sat at the same table by the window, her gaze wandering every time the door opened, her heart skipping at the possibility of seeing him again. But he never came. Days turned into weeks, and Emily had almost forgotten about him. Almost. Life had its own way of moving forward, and she had other things to focus on. She spent long hours working at the small bookshop she managed, helping customers find stories to lose themselves in, while her own story remained on pause. And then, just as the seasons began to shift, a familiar face appeared once again. It was a chilly morning in early autumn when he walked through the door. Emily was just finishing her shift, her coat already on, preparing to leave. She froze for a second, unsure if her eyes were playing tricks on her. There he was, standing at the counter, looking directly at her with the same quiet intensity from before. "Emily?" His voice was calm, but there was a note of recognition in it. "Yes?" Her voice came out softer than she expected. She felt a sudden rush of emotions she couldn't place. He smiled, and for a moment the world seemed to stop again. He stepped closer, his presence now undeniable. "I'm glad I found you," he said, his eyes soft but piercing. "I've been looking for you." "Looking for me?" The words seemed strange, like a line from a dream. She couldn't understand. How could he have been looking for her? They had never met before. Or had they? "Yes," he replied, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've seen you before, a long time ago, but we never had the chance to talk." Emily's heart thudded in her chest. Something about his words stirred a deep, unsettling feeling inside her. She had never met this man, never seen him outside the cafe. Or had she? His face seemed so familiar, yet so foreign. A shadow of recognition flashed in her mind, but it was gone before she could grasp it. Before she could respond, he handed her a small envelope, its edges worn knack, as though it had been carried around for a long time. "I think you've been waiting for this," he said, his voice quiet but insistent. "It's time you knew." Emily hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the envelope. She opened it carefully, as though the contents might shatter if she were too quick. Inside, there was a letter, yellowed with age, and a photograph. The letter was handwritten, the ink slightly faded but still legible. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the first line. To my beloved Emily, from a time long past. The photograph was of a young woman with striking features, standing beside a man who looked startlingly like the one in front of her. But the photograph wasn't just a family relic. It was dated over 100 years ago. The room seemed to spin as the realization hit her. The man in front of her wasn't just a stranger. He was someone she had known in another life. Chapter 2. The Echoes of Time. Emily's fingers trembled as she held the photograph, the image blurring slightly as her vision swam with disbelief. Her mind raced, each thought colliding with the next, unable to process what she was seeing. She glanced up at the man, his features the same as the one in the photograph. But the confusion in her chest was deeper than just recognition. It was something far older, something that tugged at her soul. You're in the photograph, Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. How? Why? He nodded, his expression serious but not quite solemn, as though he had expected her confusion. I know this is a lot to take in, but trust me, Emily, it's not a coincidence. This, he gestured to the letter, has been waiting for you for a very long time, and I've been waiting too. Her breath caught in her throat. Waiting for me? But I don't remember you. I know you don't. He took a step closer, lowering his voice as if revealing something sacred. But you will. Eventually. The world seemed to close in around her, her mind struggling to keep up with the swirling storm of emotions. This man, this stranger, wasn't a stranger at all. He was someone from her past life, to be exact. But I don't. Understand. How could this be? How could I have known you? Emily stammered, her words faltering in the heavy silence. He smiled gently, but there was a sadness in his eyes, as if he too had carried the weight of this secret for far too long. Let me explain. You and I, our connection goes back further than either of us can comprehend. We were together, in another life, in another time. I was. He paused, searching for the right words. Someone you loved, someone you lost. A chill ran through Emily's spine, her head spinning with 1,000 questions. Another life? A love lost? The idea was impossible, yet the look in his eyes, the certainty in his voice made it seem almost plausible. Before all this, he continued, before the years passed and time became what it is, we were in love. And something happened, something terrible, that tore us apart. Emily's heart raced, the photo in her hand suddenly burning against her palm. The face of the woman in the photo, her own face, seemed to look back at her, her eyes filled with longing, with something more than just a smile. It was a history, a memory that she couldn't quite grasp, yet it was there, pulsing like a heartbeat. Who were we? She asked, her voice hoarse, filled with yearning to understand. We were both young, innocent even. But we made a mistake, he said, looking away for a moment as though the memory was too painful to relive. We tried to escape, to outrun something we didn't understand, and it cost us everything. Emily looked down at the letter again. The words on the page felt alive, as though they were calling to her, begging her to remember. She let the letter slip from her fingers and slowly stood up, her body trembling from the weight of it all. Her gaze remained fixed on the photograph, her mind straining to unlock the door to her forgotten past. You're telling me that we were together? That we loved each other? She asked, the question hanging in the air like a fragile thread. He nodded, his expression somber. Yes, and I know it's hard to believe, but there's more to this story than you realize. More than what's written in that letter. More than what the photograph shows. Our love, our story, it wasn't just confined to one life. We were meant to be together again. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. But this is insane. I've never seen you before in my life. I don't remember anything of the sort. I know. His voice softened. But you will. This is just the beginning, Emily. You're starting to remember. You're starting to wake up. Wake up? She felt a sudden sense of dread. What do you mean, wake up? He took a deep breath, stepping closer, his eyes never leaving hers. I've been following you for years, watching you, and now the time has come for you to remember everything. The love we shared, the life we lived, and the price we paid. We're both trapped, Emily. Trapped in a cycle, and the only way out is for you to remember. For us to finish what we started. She stared at him, her mind reeling, trying to make sense of the words that felt like they were from a forgotten dream. But as she looked into his eyes, she felt a sense of déjà vu, as though she had heard this all before, only in a different time, a different place. Her chest tightened, a wave of fear and longing washing over her. "What do you mean, finish? How do I even begin to remember?" "By trusting me," he said quietly, "by allowing yourself to remember. It's not just about us, it's about breaking the cycle. You and I, we've been here before, and if we can't finish what we started, we'll be trapped forever." She stepped back, the room feeling smaller with each passing second. "What cycle? What are you talking about?" He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. His presence was magnetic, overwhelming. "Emily, in every lifetime, we've met. And every time, something keeps us apart. But this time, you have the power to change it, to break the chain that binds us." She swallowed hard, her throat dry. I don't know if I can do this. I don't even know who you are." "You will," he said softly. "You have to." And in that moment, Emily understood. This wasn't just a love story, it was a battle to break free from something ancient, something beyond her understanding. And yet, she felt the pull, the gravity of something greater than herself, as though the weight of all her past lives had converged into this single point in time. "I don't know if I'm ready," she whispered, her heart pounding. He reached out and gently touched her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "You don't have to be. I'll be here when you are." And as he stood there, his eyes locked on hers, Emily felt something stir deep within her. She didn't understand everything. She didn't even know if she believed him. But there was one thing she couldn't deny: the connection between them. It was undeniable. It was like a shadow in the corners of her mind, waiting to emerge. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, alone, except for the echo of a love that refused to be forgotten. Chapter 3. The Unraveling. The days that followed felt like an endless blur for Emily. The world around her continued to turn, but she was no longer a part of it in the same way. She couldn't focus on her work, couldn't concentrate on the people around her. Her thoughts were consumed with him, the man who had claimed to know her, who spoke of a love lost in the echoes of time. Every moment, she replayed their conversation, the photograph, the letter, as if her mind were trying to piece together a puzzle that wouldn't fit. She had tried to push it all aside, to forget about him. But the more she tried, the more it seemed that everything in her life had been leading up to this moment. The feeling of déjà vu, the pull in her chest every time she thought of him, it was all becoming too overwhelming to ignore. One afternoon, after days of restless sleep and wandering thoughts, Emily found herself back at the cafe. It was almost as though she had been drawn there, pulled by an invisible thread. She didn't plan it, but there she was, sitting at the same window, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her coffee cup. Her eyes scanned the room, and for a moment she thought she saw him, the man from the photograph, from her past. But when she blinked, he was gone, vanished into the crowd. A pang of longing tightened in her chest. The ache she had been trying to ignore was impossible to escape now. She stood up abruptly, the urgency of her thoughts overwhelming her, and walked toward the door. As she stepped outside into the cool air, a familiar voice called her name. Emily. Her heart skipped. She turned slowly, almost afraid of what she might find, but there he was, standing just a few feet away. His presence was magnetic, like a force she couldn't escape, and yet there was a calmness in his eyes that steadied her. "You're here again," he said quietly, almost as if he had been waiting for her. "I knew you would be." "I don't understand," Emily confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't understand any of this. What do you want from me?" He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I don't want anything from you, Emily. I never did. I've only come to help you remember." She shook her head, her thoughts racing. "Remember what? I don't know what you're talking about." His gaze softened, and for a moment he looked almost sad. "You're remembering more than you think. You've felt it, haven't you? The pull, the connection, the way things seem familiar, even when they shouldn't be." Emily didn't answer. She couldn't. It was true. Every time she thought of him, of their past, it felt like she was standing on the edge of a memory just out of reach. "I know this is difficult," he continued, But you have to trust me. I told you before, we've been through this before. Every life, every time we meet, something stands in our way. But this time, you can change it. Change it? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. How? How do I change something that I don't even remember? You've remembered more than you realize, he said, stepping even closer now. But there's more to this story. You've been searching for answers your whole life, haven't you? You've always felt that something was missing. Emily nodded slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Yes, always. But I never knew what it was. It's like there's something I should know but can't quite grasp. The man's eyes softened with understanding. That's because you've only remembered fragments, pieces of a story that's too vast to comprehend all at once. But you're starting to see it now. You're starting to see me. She took a step back, the weight of his words pressing down on her. But why? Why do I need to remember? Why can't I just move on? I don't want to be trapped in the past. He sighed, the sadness in his eyes deepening. Because you are trapped. We both are. And until you remember everything, until we finish what was started, we can't break free. We can't escape the cycle. What cycle? Her voice shook, her heart pounding in her chest. What are you talking about? The cycle of our love? He replied quietly. Every lifetime we fall in love, we lose each other, and we never get the chance to be together. We're bound by it. But this time, Emily, this time, it's different. This time, we can change everything. Emily's mind reeled. A cycle of love? Lost and found again? It sounded impossible, like a fairy tale spun out of desperation. But the certainty in his eyes made her wonder if there was something more to his words. Something buried deep within her that she had yet to uncover. You want me to trust you, she said slowly, the pieces of the puzzle starting to come together. But I don't even know who you are. You know me more than you think. His voice was soft, almost a whisper now. And you will remember. You have to. But why now? Why after all this time? She asked, her mind racing. He paused, taking a deep breath as if gathering his thoughts. Because this is the last chance, Emily. The last chance to break the cycle before it's too late. Her chest tightened. Too late for what? For both of us. He met her gaze, his expression intense. For us to be free. For you to live the life you were meant to live. If you don't remember, if you don't break this cycle, you'll never be free. You'll be trapped in this endless loop, destined to lose me, to lose everything, again and again. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the weight of his words sank in. She wanted to reject him, to run far away and pretend none of this had ever happened. But something deep inside her, a place she couldn't explain, wanted to believe him, wanted to understand what had been lost, what had been taken from her. I don't know if I'm ready, she whispered, her voice trembling. You don't have to be, he said softly. I'll wait, as long as it takes. And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving her standing there, heart heavy with 1,000 unspoken thoughts. For the first time in her life, Emily felt the weight of eternity pressing down on her. The choices she would make now, whether to remember or forget, would determine the rest of her existence. And though she didn't fully understand what was happening, she knew one thing for sure. The clock was ticking. Chapter 4. The Choice. The night that followed was restless. Emily tossed and turned in her bed, her mind replaying every word, every glance, every flicker of recognition that had passed between her and the man who claimed to know her. She tried to ignore the gnawing sensation in her chest, the sense that something momentous was just out of reach, but it was impossible. It was as though her very soul was calling out for answers, for truths she could no longer avoid. The clock ticked on, marking time, but to Emily it felt like the world had stopped. Every minute stretched into eternity as she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what it all meant. Who was he? And why did it feel like she had known him forever? She had tried to distract herself, to go about her daily routines, but the pull of his words was undeniable. You're starting to remember. You felt it. Every time she thought of him, the world seemed to blur and fade, and her thoughts would drift back to that moment when he had handed her the letter, the photograph. His presence was like an echo in her mind, one she couldn't shake, even if she wanted to. But she didn't want to. The next morning, Emily knew she had to make a decision. She couldn't keep living like this, torn between two worlds. One where she could deny everything, move forward with her life, and forget the man who had turned it upside down. Or the other, where she embraced the impossible, where she opened herself to the truth he was offering. She found herself walking to the same cafe again, the same pull guiding her steps. This time, though, she didn't hesitate. She knew what she had to do. As she entered the cafe, she scanned the room, but he wasn't there. The absence was almost comforting, as if the universe was giving her one last chance to choose, to turn around, to leave, to forget it all. But she couldn't. Not anymore. She sat at the same table by the window, staring out at the bustling street, her fingers wrapped tightly around the cup of coffee in front of her. She thought back to what he had said. "You've been searching for answers your whole life, haven't you?" It was true. There had always been something missing, something that didn't fit. And now, there was a piece, this man, this story, that seemed to be the missing link. Her thoughts were interrupted when the door swung open, and there he was. He didn't look surprised to see her. In fact, he seemed almost relieved, as though he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her to make the choice. His eyes locked on hers, and without a word, he walked over to her table and sat down. "You came," he said softly, almost as if confirming something he had known all along. "I don't know if I'm ready," Emily replied, her voice trembling with uncertainty. She wasn't sure what she was feeling anymore, fear, hope, confusion, or something else entirely. "You don't have to be," he said, "but I need you to trust me." Emily looked at him, her heart racing. "How can I trust you? How can I trust anything you're saying? You talk about cycles, about lives we've lived before, but none of it makes sense." His gaze softened, and he reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers in a gesture so familiar that it sent a shockwave through her body. "I know it doesn't make sense. It didn't at first. For me either. But this is bigger than both of us. It always has been." She pulled her hand back, feeling the cold air between them. "I want to believe you. I really do. But I'm scared. Scared of remembering things I can't explain. Scared of what it means for me." He leaned in slightly, his voice low and gentle. "I know, and you should be scared. But that's why I'm here. I won't let you face it alone, and I won't let you forget again. Not this time." The weight of his words settled over her, heavier than anything she had ever felt. There was so much at stake, so much she didn't understand. But the bond between them, the connection that pulsed beneath the surface, was undeniable. "You say we've been through this before," Emily said, her voice quiet. "But what if I can't break the cycle? What if I can't change it?" His expression darkened for a moment, the sadness in his eyes more pronounced than before. "If you don't remember, if you don't break the cycle, then we'll both be trapped. Not just in this lifetime, but in every lifetime. Forever." Her mind raced as the enormity of what he was saying sank in. Was this really happening? Could she really change something so ancient, so ingrained? Or was this just a fantasy, a dream spun by someone who didn't even know the truth of what was happening? But then she thought of the photograph, of her own face looking back at her, and of the love they had shared in another time, a love that had been lost, a love that had been torn apart by forces beyond their control. The pieces began to come together in her mind, fitting in a way that made her breath catch in her throat. "Tell me everything," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "Tell me what happened, what we need to do." He nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "I've been waiting for you to ask, to make the choice." And so he began to tell her the story. Not just the story of their love in this life, but the story of every life they had shared, of the choices they had made, the mistakes they had lived through, and the consequences of their actions. Each time they met, they had fallen in love, only to be separated by fate, by something dark and powerful that they could never overcome. But this time, he said, would be different. This time, they would remember. This time, they would break free from the cycle. As he spoke, Emily felt a strange warmth begin to rise within her. Not just understanding, but a deep, aching sense of knowing, of belonging. She wasn't sure if it was the truth or just the pull of something she had longed for, but in that moment, she felt a part of something greater than herself. She reached across the table, taking his hand once more. "I'm ready," she said, her voice stronger now, filled with determination. His eyes shone with something that might have been hope, or love, or something deeper. Then let's remember. And together, they would begin the journey to break the cycle, to finally free themselves from the past that had bound them for so long. Chapter 5. The Breaking of the Cycle. The air between them seemed to shimmer with an unseen energy, as if the very fabric of time was shifting in response to their shared resolve. Emily's heart raced, her pulse quickening as the weight of their decision settled upon her. She had chosen to remember, to face the past that had eluded her for so long, and now there was no turning back. As the man, no longer a stranger, but the key to her past, took her hand, something inside Emily stirred, a quiet whisper that seemed to come from deep within her soul. It was a memory, distant and faded, but it was there. She could feel it. It was like a fog lifting, revealing a truth she had been too afraid to face. "You're ready now," he said softly, his voice barely more than a breath. "The journey to remember isn't easy, but we're doing it together. I'll be with you every step of the way." And so, with his hand in hers, Emily closed her eyes, allowing the darkness to sweep over her. It was not the void she had once feared. It was the beginning of something new, something that had been waiting for them both. The past and the present blurred together, tangled in a dance that had spanned countless lifetimes. Images began to flood her mind, fragments of lives they had lived together, faces she recognized as her own and his. The two of them, young and old, meeting in cities she didn't remember, in moments she couldn't name. A love that had been pure and passionate, but always doomed, always torn apart by forces they couldn't control. A love that had died and been reborn, again and again. She saw it all, each life, each choice, each heartbreak. But now the pattern was shifting. She could feel it, the pull of destiny, the force that had always kept them apart, starting to unravel. This time it would be different. "I remember," she whispered, her voice trembling as the weight of the past pressed down on her. "I remember us. I remember what we were." The man's grip on her hand tightened, a quiet affirmation of her words. "Yes, we were more than lovers, Emily. We were bound by something ancient, something powerful. But we made a mistake, and that mistake kept us apart, life after life." Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she understood the enormity of their bond. Their love had been eternal, but it had been tainted by a decision made long ago, one they had never been able to correct. She saw their mistakes, their failures, and the consequences that had rippled through time, trapping them in an endless cycle. But now, for the first time, she felt the possibility of something else, a way out. "What was the mistake?" she asked, her voice filled with pain and wonder. He exhaled slowly, his eyes searching hers, as if weighing how much to reveal. "We chose fear over love. We let something else, something dark, interfere with our bond, and it broke us, each time, each life. But we didn't understand then. We do now." Emily's chest tightened as the truth settled in. Fear had kept them apart, fear of losing each other, fear of the unknown, and in every lifetime it had torn them apart, preventing them from breaking free. But now, she realized, they had the power to choose differently. They had the power to break the cycle. The world around them shifted once more, the room fading away as time itself seemed to bend. She felt herself falling, but not into darkness. She was falling toward something, toward a future, toward a freedom she had never thought possible. "Together," he whispered, his voice reverberating in her mind. "We can break free. Together, we can choose love over fear. We can rewrite our story." And then everything changed. In an instant, the weight of all their past lives, all the years of loss and longing, was lifted. Emily felt a rush of warmth, of light, of love filling every corner of her being. The bond between them was no longer a chain. It was a bridge, stretching across time, uniting them in a way that nothing could ever tear apart again. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the cafe, no longer in the world she had known. She was in a place that felt familiar, yet new. A place where time was not linear, where the past and future existed in harmony. And there, standing before her, was the man, the one who had been with her through every life, every moment of their shared eternity. He smiled at her, and for the first time, Emily saw the peace in his eyes, the peace that had eluded them for so long. "We did it," he said softly, his voice full of wonder. "We're free." Emily felt a tear slip down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of release, of liberation. She had chosen love, and it had set her free. "You were right," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of their journey. "This time, we broke the cycle." They stood there, hand in hand, as the world around them shimmered with new possibilities. The past was behind them, no longer a weight that held them captive, and the future, endless and bright, was theirs to explore, together. And so, Emily and the man, now free from the cycle of endless lifetimes, stepped into a future where their love would not be torn apart. The mistakes of the past had been undone, and in their place stood a new beginning. A love that would endure, not because it was destined to, but because it was chosen, freely and without fear. The story of their love had finally found its conclusion.